The time is now for the Dr. Bob Sports Podcast. I am Tanner. I am our head of analytics, and for the past 6 years, I have been working alongside Bob, originating our NFL and college basketball bets. And today, I am joined, as always, by our digital media specialist, Grant. How we doing?
Doing great, Tan. I am back in hot and sunny Las Vegas. So if you see me start melting through this window, don't worry, I will be okay.
Yeah, Vegas is a great place to spend a football season.
Yeah, yes, it is. There's no complaints here. But let's jump right into part two of our fantasy preview. So today we're going to be breaking down receivers and tight ends. We're going to be basing our ADP off ESPN. And when we look at recent drafts, we see that there are four receivers that are going in a variety of orders, but it goes Jefferson, Chase, Tyreek, and Cup. So Jefferson was wide receiver 1 last year. Jamar was wide receiver 11, but missed games and finished 6th in points per game. We also see that Tyreek was wide receiver 2 and Cup was wide receiver 23, but was first in points per game with 22.4. So,
Mm-hmm.
what order would you put these guys in if you're drafting today?
For me, it's Jefferson, Chase, Cup, and then Tyreek. And honestly, Jefferson might be in a tier of his own, even compared to those other three guys. Jefferson is the clear alpha on a borderline top 10 offense, and he should be getting more downfield work this year with TJ Hawkinson taking that underneath stuff. I mean, when we look at after the Vikings traded for Hawkinson last year, it made a major difference in the offense. So Kirk Cousins had a 6.1 average depth of target before they brought in Hawkinson, and he averaged 8.4 air yards per attempt after the trade in the second half of the season. Now, this wasn't because Hawkinson was suddenly a major vertical threat, but rather it freed Jefferson up to go long since Kirk finally had a reliable option underneath that they were expecting Adam Thielen to be at the beginning of the season. And so I expect Kevin O'Connell to lean into even more heavy into those Jefferson deep shots this season.
Yeah, so do any of these guys stand out as someone you were just dying to get? Or maybe is this going to be one of those situations that you're going to pass on some of these in the top of the draft, especially if you're in an auction league?
Yeah, if I'm in an auction, I'm not really ecstatic to go out and get those other three guys that we talked about off the bat. I mean, we think that the Bengals offense is going to be near the top of the NFL again, but sharing the workload with T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd is a concern for me on that Jamar Chase side. I mean, we saw Boyd take a back seat last season, gaining just 1.36 yards per route run, but that was zero point 0.3 yards per route run lower than he'd averaged in the previous 4 seasons combined. So Boyd is still in his 20s, and I don't think that he's just all of a sudden dust. So he might be getting more looks if the defenses start diverting more coverage towards Chase. The Bengals certainly have an option to go to him if he's in one-on-one situations in the slot there. So last year we saw the scales tip so much towards Chase, and we saw that Boyd was on the wrong side of that, and I don't know that we can just count on that happening again in 2023. Now on the Tyreek side, we look at it, and Tyreek had 170 targets last year, and I just feel like that's going to be hard to match, and I wouldn't be surprised if him and Waddle are closer in usage this season. Maybe something like maybe they both get in that 140 targets range, and Tyreek would still be worth drafting high in that scenario. But you said he was wide receiver 2 last year. Maybe tough to match that if he's not going to be getting so many targets. And then we talked about this risk a little bit in the last podcast when we were discussing Cam Akers, but there's always that chance that things don't go well for the Rams out of the gates and they end up resting guys down the stretch. Kupp could be one of those guys because they own their first round pick for the first time since 2016, and we don't think that the roster is very good top to bottom. So there's always a little bit of risk built in with Kupp as well.
Yeah, and so when we look just outside these big four, if you're sitting later in your draft, maybe in the first round, you may not get a shot at one of these guys, but there's still four proven alphas there with Diggs, Adams, CD, and AJ Brown. So, do any of these guys stand out above the rest?
I think for me, it's Diggs just due to consistency. Just yeah, I think you can pretty much count on Diggs delivering on his ADP here. I mean, we know he's going to have 100 receptions and 1,000+ yards in this offense if he's healthy, and he's going to get plenty of looks in the red zone for one of the league's best offenses. He finished fourth in red zone targets last season, and I just think that among these four guys, when you need to count on production when you're drafting this high. You know, you can lose a draft at the beginning, but
Mhm.
with picking a guy that could get injured or not deliver on his ADP. But usually you win drafts in the later rounds. So in the early rounds, I'm just looking for consistency, and Diggs screams consistency to me.
I don't know why, but it feels like Diggs every single year is just that discount superstar that is always falling to you. But
Yeah,
let's move on.
yeah. And of those
Yeah.
four guys, he seems like the guy that I would take in that range.
hmm So when we move on, we look at these young guys who flashed late last year. So a lot of people are drafting their second and third receivers very high right now because of their late season success. This would be Amon-Ra, Garrett Wilson, Devonta Smith, Chris Olave. Are you targeting any of these guys, or any of them kind of scaring you away?
Well, I think Amon-Ra can get up into that elite tier, the tiers above that we talked about earlier in the pod. I mean, he's the only Lions receiver above replacement level in my mind, and he was targeted on nearly a third of his routes in 2022. And the touchdowns haven't quite been there for him thus far in his career, but he's definitely going to go for 10 plus one of these years, and it might be 2023. I mean, even if you think the Lions are a league average offense, he's going to pay off of his ADP here, and I think that there is massive upside. I mean, I don't think that that someone like Jamar Chase is a huge favorite to score more fantasy points than Amon-Ra this year. They're both going to get, volume, and it's just, touchdown dependent. And Amon-Ra, you remember, was tackled inside the 5 yard line 7 times last year. And that's where all those Jamal Williams touchdowns came from. So if he just converts on those, all of a sudden we're talking about him as in the conversation for the top wide receiver in fantasy.
I had no idea that he was tackled that many times inside the 5 yard line. Is this something that we expect to kind of not happen this year? And should we be worried
Yeah, I
about
think I
those?
think that that's pretty noisy. So I don't know that we can count on, I don't know we can always count on him getting over the pylon, but it's an extremely unlucky season from a touchdown standpoint if you just keep getting tackled inside the 5 like Amon-Ra was last year, and we saw Jamal Williams benefit from it.
hmm So if we're going to target a wide receiver two this year with ESPN ADP, we see there's four veterans stacked together, and you can usually grab one of these guys in your draft. And these are guys like Debo, Keenan, Amari, Calvin Ridley. So how would you rank them? And is there anyone that you're going to target out of this four?
Well, of those four guys that you just named, I would go Ridley, Cooper, Keenan, then Debo. And Ridley just seems like the most likely to give you a top 5 season at the position in that range. I mean, his last full season in 2020, Calvin Ridley averaged 2.44 yards per route run, ranking 6th in the NFL. And Ridley was particularly effective against man coverage, which we know shows off more wide receiver skill than performance against zone coverage, which can sometimes be more noisy year to year. And he led the league with 16 deep receptions, which is defined as a pass of 20 air yards or more. So I think Ridley has shown us in the past that he is one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. I'm certainly have him in as a top 10 wide receiver going into this year. And so it wouldn't surprise me if he really breaks out, after the full season suspension that he just served.
Wow. It's interesting. You have your the way you rank them is actually the complete opposite of what the ADP has them listed at. So
Oh, there you
I
go.
think,
So there's probably you can get some value in that range.
yeah, especially on Ridley, he's the lowest one there. So let's talk about this spot in the draft. It's picks 26 through 39. And this is kind of where you're going to find your wide receiver three or your flex. And it gets a little ugly to me. So if you're in your draft and you have already picked up two running backs, your two receivers, but you need that wide receiver three, you might find yourself looking at this list and kind of just scratching your head a little bit. The names in this area are guys like Mike Evans, Deontay Johnson, Brandon Ayuk, George Pickens, Drake London, Michael Pittman, JSN, or Traylon Burks. So are you going to avoid any of these guys? And if so, who are you possibly targeting if you like some of them?
Well, on Wednesday, we saw Traylon Burks went down at practice and got carted off. So we're going to have to monitor his injury situation. Another guy that I might be avoiding in this range is Mike Evans, just because we've seen him be relatively, I mean, he's always going for 1,000 yards, but we've also seen him relatively touchdown dependent because he's that big body red zone target throughout his career. I mean, he's averaging 9 touchdowns per season throughout his career. And now he's on an offense that might average less than 20 points per game. So obviously ADP in this range is reflecting on that a little bit, but I'm certainly not running out to get Mike Evans now that he doesn't have Tom Brady throwing him the ball, or even, Jameis Winston, who we could count on to get in shootouts. I doubt the Bucs are going to be playing in a lot of shootouts this year, just with either Mayfield or Trask at quarterback, and then obviously a defensive head coach in Todd Bowles. Now, the one guy I would go with in this range of the guys you mentioned would be Drake London. So this year, they brought in Mac Hollins to provide a deep threat to stretch those safeties down the field. And I think that opens it up for London to be used in the A.J. Brown role in this Arthur Smith offense. So, he can do coming off of play action looks. London can get in those crossers that we saw AJ Brown so successful with when in his time in Tennessee when he was a young wide receiver in the NFL. And London finished 12th in yards per route run as a rookie. So that signals to me that he has a potential to be one of the top wide receivers in this league.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I really like Drake London this year. But when we're looking at wide receivers or just passing attacks in general, is there any of those that you're kind of trying to avoid this year?
Well, we talked a little bit about this when we were going over Christian McCaffrey, but all the 49ers guys, to me, I'm just staying away from. And that's not because I necessarily am down on the Niners in general, but it's just there's so many mouths to feed. I mean, you've got McCaffrey, Ayuk, Debo, Kittle, and there's only so many touchdowns and so many yards for this offense to gain. And we know that they're probably not going to finish top 5 in scoring, because anytime that Kyle Shanahan gets a lead, his main goal is to kill the game, right? Just start running the ball, milking that clock. And so the Niners, are probably going to finish in that 5 to 10 range in scoring. And all of these guys are being drafted high in fantasy. So I'm staying away. And, in terms of receivers, I'm staying away from Ayuk and Debo. And the other team that I'm a little bit hesitant on is the Giants, because they have 8 guys on this roster that I think are capable NFL receivers. I mean, with Slayton, Hodgins, Campbell, Shepard, Crowder, Wan'Dale Robinson, Cole Beasley, and they drafted Jalen Hyatt. That's a lot of guys in the wide receiver room that should be, pretty solid. And I just don't know where it's going to shake out on the depth chart. So I'm guessing someone's going to separate themselves, but your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah. So if there's a receiver out there that you just don't want to miss out on, someone you think could just blow up, who would that be?
Give me Gabe Davis as a post-hype sleeper this year. I mean, he finished as wide receiver 36 last year, which I believe was at basically the low end of his outcomes. And now he's being drafted as wide receiver 47. So if he finished, at the bottom of his range last year, and now he's being drafted even lower than that already, I don't really understand that. But when we look further, Davis had 25 deep targets in 2022, which ranked 13th most among receivers, and he only hauled in 9 of them. And if he can just connect on a few more of those, he should be a top 25 wide receiver. Just get a few more deep balls. And we also saw that, Josh Allen's elbow wasn't healthy. So there could be an accuracy issue there too. And I just think that, if Davis can match the 25 deep targets, or even, get it up closer to 30 and then connect on just a little bit higher percentage, he would all of a sudden be in the top 25 fantasy wide receivers.
Yeah, as someone that was a pretty big investor in Gabe Davis last year, I'll tell you right now, it's way too hard to try and press the button on drafting him.
Click that button.
Oh my gosh, I just am so burnt by him. All right, so if you're looking for a last round dart throat receiver that could bring value to your team this year, who's that guy?
Well, I think we just got to start up with that Richie James hype train that we talked about in our very first podcast. We talked about how Richie could be impactful from a gambling standpoint, but I think he could be just as impactful, if not more, as a fantasy player this year, because someone needs to soak up those 100 targets and nearly 1,000 receiving yards that went out the door this season in Juju Smith-Schuster. So, and there might even be more work available if Travis Kelce takes a step back in his age 34 season. And so we look at the names on this Chiefs depth chart, and I don't think that Sky Moore is a very good player. We know the role that MVS is going to play, stretching the field and getting 4 to 5 targets per game. Kadarius Toney is already nursing a knee injury, and he's been volatile at every point in his career. Rashee Rice is a second-round rookie, so I don't think you can all of a sudden, count him in for 100 targets and 1,000 yards. And meanwhile, I believe that Richie James is at least a top 40 wide receiver skill-wise in the NFL, maybe better. I mean, he had the 4th highest success rate when targeted last season between T. Higgins and Tyler Lockett. We talked about how his CROE, which is a metric that NFL Next Gen Stats does with their tracking data that measures the difficulty of completion using a number of factors, including separation from the nearest defender, depth of target, speed of pass, etc. And James was the best in the NFL at that metric, above guys like George Pickens, Mike Williams, Dallas Goedert, Cooper Kupp, Tyler Boyd, a bunch of big names on the top 10 list. And then we go one step further, and the 538 receiver rankings factor in the ability to get open and yards after catch, as well as that difficulty of completion that we talked about. And they had James as the 26th best receiver in the league last year. And for reference, Juju ranked 44th in that metric. So I think it may have taken a little time for the Chiefs coaching staff to realize that James is their best option there. They wanted to try out everyone, but even now, after preseason game 1, we're getting reports out of camp that Richie James is running with the first team offense more often.
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed that up perfectly. I mean, we're not saying to go out in the 10th round and go grab Richie James, but at that, you get him for free. It is literally free at the end of your draft, and you have the chance to be tied to a Patrick Mahomes-led offense. I mean, why not swing on that? But let's move over to tight end. So this is a tricky position to me. It's one of those things that you can either spend high draft capital on a guy who should be a clear positional advantage, or you can wait a little bit and take a shot on a guy who you think will be a breakout. So how do you target the tight end position in drafts?
Well, in home leagues, I typically like to get a guy I know is going to get at least 5 targets a week, because you only start so many positions, in your lineup every week. And I just don't want one of those guys to be a dud. Maybe, it depends on what your league is starting, but there might only be 10 guys out there, 8 guys out there, and just rolling a dud out or someone that you're just, kind of hoping he just gets a touchdown isn't the strategy that I would typically go with for a tight end. Now in best ball, it's kind of different. You could play this a little bit differently. You could wait all the way to the end of the draft and just take 3 guys and just hope that one of those 3 guys gets a touchdown each week, because you get, whatever the best score is at that position. So 2 different approaches for 2 different types of ways to play fantasy.
All right. So when we look at the tight ends, there's that clear big 2. You have Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews. And so Kelce is going significantly higher right now. I saw him go first overall in my home league last week.
Oh, wow.
But yeah. Do you look to target either of those guys, or do they worry you a little bit this year?
I'm not really in on either of those guys. I do think age could catch up to Travis Kelce, and Andrews all of a sudden has a lot more target competition after the Ravens have a healthy Rashad Bateman. They drafted Zay Flowers in the first round. Use quite a bit of capital on him, and then they signed Odell to a decent sized contract. And I kind of like their second tight end, Isaiah Likely, as well. So Andrews has been in an offense throughout his career where he has been the only good/great receiver in the offense, and now there's a lot more mouths to feed. So I'm not really in on either Kelce or Andrews this year.
All right, and we look at the guys who've kind of done it before. You see this trio of tight ends are Hockenson, Waller, and Kittle. So Hockenson finished as the tight end 2 after being traded to the Vikings last year. And it's been a couple of years since we've seen Waller be his elite self, but he's on the Giants now, which should help. And Kittle, who's had consistent top 4 finishes 4 out of the last 5 years. So do you like to get any shares of these guys, or do they bring concern at their ADP?
I think there's a pretty good chance Hockenson delivers his ADP. He's a safe pick, the kind of guy I was talking about I would want in a home league, because you can expect him to get plenty of targets. I'm staying away from the Giants wide receivers, but I also like Waller as well. You have to remember that offensive coordinator there, Mike Kafka, was in Kansas City in his prior stop. And so he knows how to get, a good skill tight end the ball. And then I think you can really buy low on Waller after he just didn't fit in the Josh McDaniels offense. I think we can count on Waller being a top 5 tight end skill wise. And so if Kafka can use him in any of the ways that, they use Travis Kelce in Kansas City, or even the ways that John Gruden was using Waller in Las Vegas, I think that Waller should have a pretty solid bounce back season. It might be a buy low situation.
All right. And so we look at the kind of the 70 to 90 ADP tight ends. So if you miss out on these 5 before, you're not dead yet, because there's still 4 tight ends still waiting for you. These guys are Dallas Goedert, Kyle Pitts, Evan Ingram, and Pat Freiermuth. So Goddard was 5th in points per game, but he finishes a tight end 12. Pitts was tight end 33, but was 24th in points per game. Ingram was tight end 5, and Freiermuth was tight end 7. So if you're in this range and the rest of your positions they should be looking good if you've kind of avoided tight end this whole time. Is there anyone that feels like a steal at their ADP?
Oh, give me Goddard. I mean, like you said, he finished 5th in tight end points per game last season, and now I expect the Eagles to pass a lot more since their schedule won't be cake. Philadelphia's offense had more run plays than pass plays last season, but that was just a consequence of all those huge leads that they built throughout the year. I mean, Philly's pass play rate in neutral situations was 59%, which was 5th highest. And then Philadelphia's offense will also likely have more plays as the Eagles snap the ball 2 seconds quicker when the game was within 6 points last year than they did when they were leading by a touchdown or more. So we can expect more Eagles offense plays and more passing plays, which should result in more targets to Goddard, who was already 5th in point per game among tight ends. And then Goddard actually led all receivers in the NFL last year in terms of EPA per target. And we know that organization is pretty data driven, and we could see them trying to get him more looks just because they had so much success in the looks that they gave him last year. Also, Hurts might pull back a little bit on the rushing because the Eagles have kind of established themselves as one of the best teams in the NFC, and Hurts will know that he needs to be fully healthy come playoff time. And so instead of taking off to run, we could see him, kind of dump the ball off to Dallas Goedert on some of those plays as well. So all signs look good for me for Dallas Goedert this season, as long as he can stay healthy.
Yeah, totally agree with that one. I was pretty upset. I got him sniped 1 pick ahead of me in my home league draft. But let's say you've just punted this tight end position completely and you need to find a guy towards the end of your draft. You're nearing those final few rounds. Who's your guy to target?
I'll take a Okonkwo in Tennessee. There's a chance he could give you a season like we saw with Tannehill and Jonnu Smith in 2020, maybe 500 yards and 8 touchdowns. So, every other week he might be getting into the end zone for you and, giving you a little bit of yardage on top of that. And also, even if Will Levis comes in late as the starter in Tennessee, we typically see rookies rely more heavily on tight ends than veterans. So I kind of like that guy when you're looking at tight ends, in the 15 to 20 range.
Yeah, I know a lot of people were pretty high on him until the DeAndre Hopkins signing, and now he's kind of starting to slip back down in your draft.
Lose a little target share, but I still think there might be some talent there, and certainly there'll be plays drawn up for him in this offense.
All right, let's move over to some of the questions we got on the last YouTube post. So the first one comes from actually one of our league mates, and he asked, how do you think the splits will be with the Dalvin Cook situation and also Breece Hall's?
Yeah, our league mate's coming in and trying to get intel on the podcast. Seems like some sort of collusion. I'm not sure what you would call it, but I will answer the question for all the other listeners. So Dalvin Cook has signed since we last talked on our running backs podcast on Wednesday. And Aaron Rodgers took that big pay cut for the Jets to sign someone. And who did they go out and sign? Dalvin Cook, someone that used to play in his division in the NFC North. So you have to think that Aaron Rodgers likes Dalvin Cook and wanted the Jets to go out and spend that money to get him. And now I'm a little bit worried that about Breece Hall's role because let's say that Aaron Rodgers feels more comfortable with Dalvin Cook pass blocking on third down sets and stuff like that. It could eat into Breece's Brees's passing work. And then, I'm not convinced that Brees Hall is going to get more carries than Dalvin either. They gave him a decent sized contract. So now I'm all of a sudden seeing a split backfield there, and I really don't feel confident at all in Brees Hall, and would probably be looking to trade him because even though he's moved back in ADP, I'm not sure he's moved far enough yet.
Yeah, it's just a bad situation for Brees. I mean, there's the slight chance that they just kind of used Dalvin at the beginning of the year, but with how much money they paid him, I don't think that's going to be the situation there.
Yeah, and Brees, he's a young guy, so and Rodgers is going to want someone he can trust, particularly on passing downs.
Mm-hmm. Well, we got another question. I think this might be from a Nebraska homer because he asked, do you guys think that Trey Palmer will be the wide receiver 1 in Tampa?
I'm not sure that's a serious question, but we thank you for your question anyways. But yeah, I do not think that, even no matter, he has been showing some flashes in camp, but Mike Evans and Chris Godwin both have gone consecutive 1,000-yard receiver seasons. So those will be the top two guys in an offense that, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not super excited about. So I don't think I'll be going in on any Buccaneers from a fantasy standpoint this year.
Yeah. I do like Trey Palmer, though. He looked good in the preseason so far, and hopefully he keeps building off that. But that will do it for our wide receivers and tight ends fantasy preview.
And next episode, we're going to have Bob back on to talk about his college football win totals. And Bob is 50-21-1 lifetime on those regular season win totals and 19-3 the last 2 years. So we usually see massive market movement on that release that he's going to have Monday morning. So go to the website if you want to get access to that before they come out on Monday. And then on Wednesday's podcast, we will discuss some of the reasoning behind the teams he's selected.
Sounds like that's going to be a good episode on Wednesday. But as always, make sure to like and subscribe if you have not.